Okay, class, this week, Chapter 4, Tools of the Trade. Some of you might be straight out of Principles of Interviewing and Counseling. Others of you may have not had it for a few semesters. But this chapter really is our review for active listening skills. This week we'll have some returned practice to paraphrasing, empathy, all the different listening skills. So there are all kinds of listening skills, active listening skills. Some of the fundamental ones that are discussed in Chapter 4 are open-ended question, close-ended question, restatement, and summary clarification. Restatement would be paraphrasing, reflecting of content, or empathy, reflection of feeling, owning feelings, facilitative listening, in other words, helping people move forward. These are kind of the fundamental skills we're going to talk about this week. So open-ended questions are great. Open-ended questions really give us the most thoughtful answers by our clients. Open-ended questions usually start with what or how, when. They encourage clients to respond in full statements with deeper meaning. They help clients think about their feelings, their thoughts, their behavior. It's very helpful in looking at problem exploration, tasks, and under task 2 of the 6-step model, problem exploration, you're going to use open-ended questions. So developing open-ended questions, you want descriptions. Tell me more, please tell me, show me, in what ways does blah, 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 blah. Okay, focusing on plans. What will you do? How are you going to handle that? How will you make it happen? How will that help you? Expansion. So then what happened? Then what happened? Tell me more. Could you give me more details? So then what happened? All right, assessment. When that happened, how did you handle it? How is this different from before? What are you doing about that? When that happened, who might help you? So those are kind of ways that you can ask open-ended questions. You want to stay away from why questions because they put clients on the defensive. Why do you continue to beat your wife? Is going to get you nothing but all sorts of anger. So you want to stay away from why questions. So here is the difference between regular counseling and crisis intervention. Closed-ended questions are very important, especially at the beginning. You need specific concrete information from the client. You have to get specific behavioral data, and yes or no responses are fine in a crisis. Closed-ended questions usually begin with verbs such as do, did, does, can, have, had, will, are, is, and was. So again, they are really used early on to get specific information to give you the background. You want to enable the crisis worker to make a quick assessment. You want to see how, oftentimes closed-ended questions let you know whether the person is really with it. Can they really answer your questions in real time? Do they know where they are? Do they know what year it is? Do they know what day it is? These are closed-ended questions that kind of help you see if the person is oriented. It's often used during the early stages, and it helps with obtaining commitments during the action planning stage and assessing safety issues. So some of the guidelines for using closed-ended questions: when you need to request specific information such as where are you going to go? When was the first time that this happened? Are you thinking of hurting her? Have you gone back there? Does this mean you're going to kill yourself? You always have to ask very direct, very specific questions, specifically around safety issues. So very important to have some good closed-ended questions in mind to assess safety. The second guideline is for obtaining a commitment. Are you willing to make an appointment? Will you confront him about this? Do you agree to keep yourself safe? Do you agree to call if you need anything? When will you do this? It's very specific. The next one is to increase focus. Are you on track with me? Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you do this for me now? Can you repeat back to me what I just said to you? Avoid negative interrogatives. In other words, sometimes if we start a sentence with don't, doesn't, isn't, aren't, or wouldn't, these all tend to seek agreement. So example would be, don't you believe it's true? It's really a camouflaged statement saying, I believe that it's true, and if you have an ounce of sense, you'll agree with me. So We don't want to set people up to agree with us. We want them to be able to think for themselves. Restatement and summary clarification. If you are in Principles of Interviewing and Counseling, this would be what you recognize as paraphrasing or reflecting content, or empathy reflecting feeling. The client may not be able to communicate effectively because of the chaotic environment or their cognitive status. So restatement lets the clients know you're listening. It's often used in Task 6 for obtaining commitment either by the client or the crisis worker. Owning feelings. This is the use of I statements, and it helps communicate. It helps communicate a bond between the client and the crisis worker. We only use we when referencing the crisis worker and the client. In this together, this is the idea that we're going to be collaborating. Relational markers are when we use this. Relational markers shorten the psychological distance between the client and the worker through the use of the word this and these, we and our, here and now, as opposed to that, those, mine, there, and then. So on page 77 there in the middle, there is a little comment by a therapist, Sita, the crisis worker, and it says, Jake, I know it is tough, but this, which means right now, right here, is something we can work out. While I don't have much, I can't do much about that, which is the pastime or out there stalking behavior. We can start on this right now, right here, self-monitoring anger management model. So using this language set the stage for examining alternatives, making plans, and undertaking commitments, and engaging in safer behavior. So you can see that this is at the beginning, one of those first 3 tasks in the rules of the road when you're using listening. It's really important here that we also own our own feelings and our own statements. So it's very important that we don't disown any feelings of confusion or frustration. We don't need to pretend like we have it all together and like we know everything that's going on. So it's very important for us to be honest. We have to convey understanding. Use I understand to convey the comprehension of a situation, but not what the client is going through. For example, one client worker might say, I do understand it's frustrating when she gives you the cold shoulder and all the ways you try to win her over doesn't work. And then you could also say, I understand right now that it's so frustrating. The only thing that seems to work is lashing out. So it's not condoning behavior. It is condoning behavior. It's discussing behavior, not personal characteristics, okay? So we're going to take little mini steps to try to get a client to calm down or stop engaging in dangerous behavior. So it's really important that we're going to try to use positive reinforcement as they start to take those steps towards the larger goal. We want to set clear limits to maintain personal integrity and safety, and use assertive comments, direct, specific, and owning statements to obtain a commitment for the client. I would say page 78 and page 79 in your text has a lot of good examples, and I would direct you towards the crisis worker and the interaction with the client named Jake. Very good examples of how this is done. The 4 key aspects of facilitative listening. We have to really listen to the client. Listening is very active. It is not a passive thing. To be able to focus entirely on a client takes a lot of work. So we really want to let the client know that we're going to do our best to focus totally on them. We're going to attend with both our verbal and nonverbal messages. We're going to assess their readiness to enter into contact with others, psychological and physical. We're going to demonstrate attention to both the verbal and the nonverbal behavior. We're going to convey our understanding of the crisis situation, both the facts and the emotions of the client. We want to help the client to expand their view of the crisis. Remember, people in crisis often have tunnel vision, so we want to help them see more clearly what's going on around them. And we want to assess the client in comprehending the full impact of the crisis. The 9 basic strategies for crisis intervention we really have talked about since last week when we talked about stages of intervention from the second part of your workbook. We want to create awareness, support the client in becoming cognizant of their emotions, behaviors, and thoughts, because those may be what's hindering their mobility and their ability to think clearly about the situation. We want to allow catharsis. In other words, we want them to be able to vent, but without escalating them emotionally. So it's appropriate for a client who is not able to express their emotions rather than a client whose feelings are already out of control. In other words, if they're already out of control, we may not need to allow for catharsis because it's already happening. We want to provide support. We want to affirm that the client's reactions are common instead of normal. Because if they have any other reactions and we use the word normal, then we may make them feel even more isolated and alone. We never, ever support a client's intentions to harm self or others. We never support that feeling. Promoting expansion. We want to help the client open up the tunnel vision of the crisis. All right, we want to emphasize focus. Sometimes people are all over the place in crisis. So rather than having tunnel vision, they are just so overwhelmed because they see the whole crisis all at once. So this is about helping people partialize or break things down into smaller components that are more manageable. We want to provide guidance or offer education and referral. Oftentimes clients don't know who to turn to, who can help them, so we want to talk about different resources and support groups in their area that could help them. Promote mobilization. We want to help them develop their coping skills and their problem-solving skills. We want to implement order, which is going to aid the client in organizing and prioritizing problems. We want to help them figure out what they should do first. And providing protection. Safety is key in all areas of crisis intervention. So protecting the client from engaging in harm to self or others. Just like we talked about in our ethics and values PowerPoint, it's really important that the crisis worker demonstrate empathy, genuineness, and acceptance. Those are really important. They need to know that you genuinely care. Empathy, the way we define empathy is the ability to listen to the other person and understand their feelings about their situation. The difference between empathy and sympathy is my feelings about somebody else's situation. Empathy is me understanding their feelings about their situation. It's often described as the ability to put ourselves into somebody else's shoes and see what it's like for them and their experience. So when do we know how to act in a crisis? Last week we talked about the triage assessment form when we talked about the idea of collaborative versus directive intervention. The same thing kind of goes through this week as we talked about try to figure out when are we directive, when are we collaborative, and when are we non-directive. The appropriate of the crisis worker's level involvement depends on the client's degree of mobility. The crisis worker attempts to move from directive to non-directive, from the initiating crisis event, if the client is immobile, to the resolution. Our idea is to get the clients mobilized, to get them moving forward in their life so they can handle what they face. So a directive approach is just what I just described. The crisis worker is responsible for defining the problem, exploring alternatives, developing a plan, and guiding the client to follow the plan. The crisis worker takes temporary control and responsibility for the situation. The triage score is in the high teens or 20s in the directive counseling approach. The collaborative approach is the we approach. The crisis worker is in partnership. We serve as a temporary catalyst, a consultant, and a facilitator. This triage score would be in the high single digits to the mid-teens. And then the U approach, or the non-directive counseling approach. This is desired when the client is able to initiate and follow through with their own action plan. The client owns the problem, coping skills, plan, action, commitment, outcomes. The goal is to give the client as much control as possible. Crisis workers serve as a support person who listens, encourages, and reflects. This would have a very low triage score, low to mid single digits. So who are the immobilized clients? What are some of the problems that they may have? Somebody who needs immediate hospitalization due to chemical use or some sort of health problem. Somebody who's suffering from severe depression, who's experienced a psychotic episode or a break with reality, someone suffering from severe shock, bereavement, or loss due to some sort of traumatic event, people suffering from severe anxiety, experiencing delusions for any reason and is a danger to self or others. These clients, we are going to immediately seek hospitalization. So we looked at the rules of the road for our clients, but what about the rules of the road for crisis workers? It's really important to know that we all have individual differences as well, and that each crisis is different. Each client is different and unique. So it's important to not say, oh, I've helped hundreds of people who are suicidal before. It's a cookie cutter approach. We really want to take a unique approach to individual differences. Look at yourself. Consistently examine your own values, your emotional status, your limitations, and your readiness. If we're having a crisis in our own lives and we are crisis workers, we can have working in crisis can kind of bring on more crisis in our own life. So really be aware of what's going on in your own life and what your limitations are. Show regard for your client's safety. Seek consultation if necessary. It's always best to have two people perform an assessment on somebody who you're concerned is a danger to themselves or others. Don't hesitate to ask for assistance from your supervisor. Provide client support. Really, we want to demonstrate unconditional positive regard for our client. Try to maintain a judgment-free zone. No matter what they've done or what they're going through, they really just need somebody to listen to them. So it's really important to put aside your bias. Define the problem clearly. Focus on one specific problem from the client's point of view. Consider the alternatives. Be creative and when possible use alternatives generated by the client. Plan action steps. Short-term plans will allow the client to increase their mobility. So just small steps are very important. Use the client's coping strengths. Don't ignore their strengths and their coping skills. If this has happened to them before, ask them how they managed to get through it before. What are some things that you've done in the past when you faced really difficult times? Use referral resources. Have an up-to-date and easily accessible list of names, phone numbers, addresses, and contact people for referral. I used to keep a binder on my desk with all of the most important numbers, important programs that I thought were the most helpful, and develop and use networks. It's really important that you use the networks that are available to you at your agency.